What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and for some reason I kept thinking there were 6 issues of the lives and deaths of Wolverine when there's only 5. So that's why it took us so long, because I was like, where are these 6 issues at, man? Come on, Marvel, get it together. And it looks like it was just me. So, in the last video, we did on the 10 Lives of Wolverine, what had essentially happened here, and what had kind of been going on behind the scenes, is that Omega Red was the one who was hopping through the time stream, basically trying to find a way to destroy Charles Xavier, and that Wolverine's mind had been sent into the past to basically stop Omega Red. We didn't fully know exactly how it was that Omega Red had ended up in the time stream, but we eventually learned that Mikhail Rasputin, who is what you would call a reality breaker, he's great. I love Mikhail Rasputin. That he had basically used what was called the Cerebro Sword, which was basically like a technological sword, essentially, that where Xavier could use Cerebro to take the mind of Wolverine and send it into the past. That using the Cerebro Sword and plunging it into the chest of Omega Red, that Mikhail could send the mind of Omega Red, or even his spiritual essence to a degree, into the past, which basically allowed this kind of cat and mouse game between Arcady and Logan. And so because of that, one of the things that had gone on here is that ultimately Omega Red had realized that with Wolverine trying to stop him every step of the way, the best way to essentially guarantee the destruction of Professor Xavier somewhere in the time stream before he can form the X-Men and all that kind of stuff is to basically take over Wolverine. And that's exactly what Omega Red did. And that's why you see Wolverine kind of thrashing here as best he can, and really Xavier and Jean Grey doing what they can. But one of the things that they say here is that with Omega Red taking over the mind of Logan, that because of the fact that Logan's mind was in the time stream, that in essence, what Omega Red had done is he had just gone to the body of Wolverine and just taken that over, right? So it's like, if you could remove your essence from your physical body is just a shell. It's just sitting there. So all somebody would have to do is come along and just step into your body, and then they control you. And that's exactly what's happening here. And the biggest concern is that if that's the case, Wolverine's mind being lost in the time stream, I mean, here's the thing. It's like trying to find a needle in a stack of needles. Say, for example, that like Wolverine's physical body had been lost somewhere in the time stream. Well, then they can use some kind of modification on Cerebro that can search the time stream and then likely pinpoint where Wolverine is, right? Within reason, within maybe a day or so or something like that, kind of figure out where he's at. And as you guys know, Wolverine does go on the move. In those early days, he was on the move all the time, but he would be on the move in like a general geographical area, right? It wouldn't be one of those things where like one day he's in like the Canadian wilderness and the next day he's in like South America. One, because at that point in time, it was impossible to travel between those two places over the course of a day. And 2, well, they didn't have planes back then, but 2, it was just one of those things where he would just reside in a general area for a while. When it comes to his mind being lost, how the hell do you find that? I mean, Xavier is powerful, but we haven't really seen a whole lot of instances where his mind can search the entire time stream. And 2, even in those instances where he has, it takes him a long time to pinpoint a particular person. Plus, trying to discern the difference between the modern day Wolverine's mind being lost in the time stream versus like any iteration of his younger self, right? So it makes it incredibly difficult to do. But ultimately, we do switch over to younger Wolverine in 1900, right? Now remember, this is about the earliest version of his character that we saw in this kind of time fight between himself and Omega Red. And of course, he ended up saving this version of Charles. And what ended up really happening following this is that Logan stayed on board as basically I don't know what you would really call it in the world of like sailing and the world of ships, but like an assistant. I don't know ship terms, right? I don't understand ship terms, right? If any of you guys do, post a comment. I'm sure people would they'd be curious just to see what it is. But nonetheless, Wolverine was basically here, or Logan was here as essentially an assistant. Now, a part of me also has to believe the reason he stayed on board is to also ensure that like Omega Red wouldn't come back and try to kill basically this version of Charles, but also keep in mind that the modern day Wolverine, when his essence goes into a younger version of himself, as soon as the mission is accomplished, he leaves. And so it's almost like modern Wolverine possesses younger Wolverine, and then Xavier's saved. So modern Wolverine moves on to another version of himself in the time stream. So in effect, this younger version of Logan is really him. He's not possessed by his future self who's traveling through time. And it's really kind of interesting in terms of why he stayed here, because one of the things that this version of Charles says, right, this way back in the day version of Charles, like his great, some, amplified several times over, father, that he was like, look, man, like given everything you've done and the way you've been in service to me, we could take you back to England, right? We could have you basically brought in as a cadet of the Royal Navy, which I don't know if that's a big deal or not, but we can make a life for you, right? And the response response of this version of Logan is, no, I have no loyalty, not to a flag, not to anybody. Like, and so it's kind of like, well, then why are you here? You know, if it's like, hey man, like you've been just kind of here on this job site hanging around for a little while. Do you want a job? No, I don't want a job. I don't have loyalty to anybody. And then you just run off into the sunset. It's like, okay, I guess that kind of makes sense. It may also be because of the fact that, you know, they were stranded just sort of out in the Arctic, right? When Logan first came across him, and they've just been making their way back to Canada ever since. And they just got here, right? And so he's just like, I mean, look, man, you were a way back. You know, you were my ride, but don't have any illusions, man. Like, just because you know, I hitchhiked and you picked me up does not mean I want to be your best friend. And then ultimately just kind of ends up leaving. But before he does, what ends up happening is this version of Charles gives Logan a watch and is like, look, okay, I understand you have no loyalties, you don't want to be tied down to people, that's cool, do your thing, but take this, right? I feel I owe you for saving my life. Please accept this gift that I'm giving to you. What you do with it is up to you, but I feel like at the very least, this is a way in which I can thank you, you know. And it's a really, really cool thing because he says, like, it's a compass, but it's also a watch. And the response of Charles is, no matter how deep in the wilderness you travel, I hope you never lose your way. So it's kind of the sentimental, really kind of bond between the two. And so following that, of course, as younger Wolverine is making his way back to shore, he's seized by Xavier in the present day. And Xavier is like, okay, like, do not lose your way. Here's the thing, you have to come back to us. Now, what Charles Xavier's doing here is he's using the mind of the younger Wolverine as an anchor point, right? Seemingly, it's like present day Wolverine's mind touched the mind of his younger self. So it's like tracing breadcrumbs, right? Following footsteps or tracks in the snow. And so using that, while he's not able to exactly pinpoint modern Wolverine, it's enough to where he can kind of reach out to his mental imprint out there in the time stream, using his younger self as an anchor point, which is just kind of like, you have to come back. Like, I don't know where you are, but you have to find a way back to us. And that, of course, leads to the younger Wolverine, or at least leads to Wolverine's mind, returning to his physical body. And in doing so, it forces the mind of Omega Red out of the body of Wolverine, so things are back to the way that they're supposed to be. That the mind of Omega Red goes back into his own body, Wolverine gets his body back, and then it's just like, okay, so while I was in the body of Omega Red, like, I basically saw through the eyes of Omega Red, and I saw what was going on. Of course, he also saw what was going on here. And so ultimately what you end up doing is you switch over to Russia with Mikhail Rasputin, and there's actually a lot more going on here than there initially seems, which is really interesting. And so, of course, with Omega Red basically waking up, this is when Mikhail Rasputin is like, you're an absolute failure, right? Like, you are just as much of a failure as I thought you were. Like, literally, you had the whole of the time stream to find a way to kill Charles Xavier, and you couldn't do it. The whole time stream. Sure, Wolverine was finding you, but like, you had the entirety of the time stream. You didn't even have to like attack Xavier head on. You could have just like taken over the body of some assassin. You could have taken over the body of I don't know, Black Widow, and like assassinated Xavier as he was just going down the road somewhere. Right? You could have been anybody in the time stream. And instead, you, Omega Red, are the same idiot you always were, which is, well, there's Xavier, I'm going to attack him head on, right? And so it's really interesting because in a lot of ways, what it's doing is it's almost kind of Benjamin Percy, I wouldn't say poking fun at his own plot, but basically focusing on the idea that Omega Red is just not capable. And ultimately, Omega Red even tries to beg and is like, look, okay, fine, send me back, right? Like I am not giving you the Cerebro sword back. Send me back like 5,000 years or something like that. And like, we'll find a way to win. But the reality here is that Mikhail Rasputin isn't really talking about the failure of Omega Red in the sense that he could not kill Xavier head on. Again, he's talking about the failure of Omega Red in the sense that like, he's got no imagination. And in truth, that was one of the biggest weak points of Omega Red. Now, make no mistake, because of how he was written back in the day, right? Like back in the 90s, and because the 90s were an era of just high-octane, fast-paced stories, Omega Red was brutal. He wasn't really as brutal as characters were in like the 80s. Like, let me tell you something, man. Comic book characters in the 80s, like, look, here's the thing, man. Sabretooth, for example, in the 1980s, oh, he was nuts. It was amazing reading Sabretooth stories back in the 1980s. He was just brutal, right? Like you go back and you pick up any of those comics that were written in the 80s about Sabretooth, you'd be like, no way Marvel would write a story like this about Sabretooth now. Now it's all about Sabretooth, you know, he's in the middle of fighting Wolverine, but it's not really the fight, like, it's not really like a fight, knockdown, drag out fight. It's like, you know, they're skirmishing. But back in the 1980s, man, they were some brutal fights. And the way that Omega Red was written in the 90s was much the same way, right? He was extreme, hardcore, and a lot of that's changed. Even through all of that, the biggest issue with Omega Red is he was never imaginative. And that's one of the things that, like, Mikhail Rasputin says is, you know what, I should never have relied on you, Omega Red. Like, you know, you keep the damn Cerebro sword, I don't care. You know, I've got places to be. I knew I never should have relied on you. After all, you are a relic of the old Soviet Russian Republic, right? The old Soviet Republic. And they had no imagination. They had no real ingenuity. They couldn't think outside the box. I need a new Russia, right? I need a more ingenuitive mind out there besides your own. And he ultimately ends up leaving. Now, having said all of that about how, like, Omega Red in the modern day isn't nearly as brutal as he used to be, Benjamin Percy fixes that in an instant, right? So what ends up happening is, of course, you basically have Wolverine who's teleported to where Omega Red's located, and what follows is probably one of the most brutal fights in the history of these two characters. And keep in mind, man, again, we're comparing this to, like, everything from basically 1992 and 1993 going forward throughout the 1990s. Now, the reality is Omega Red only really had like 1.5 good years in Marvel Comics before Marvel basically crapped the bed and almost went bankrupt and just couldn't really tell compelling stories about Omega Red because they were trying to financially stay afloat. But the fights between him and Wolverine were legendary, and that's exactly what you get here, right? It's one of those things where Wolverine has this amazing monologue that he goes into, and I love this monologue. It's absolutely phenomenal, right? So as these two guys are fighting, what Wolverine says here is he says, something happens when you live a long time and you travel a lot. You like going back to places. He says you like to seek out on purpose what you found by accident before, to recapture the feeling of discovery. If you find where you've been before, whether it's a bar in an alley, a shrine on a mountain, everything inevitably is different. That mountain's still there, but it's smaller. The day is stormy instead of sunny. It's spring instead of autumn. You're alone instead of with pals, whatever. But that electricity is still there. You plug it in, you remember where you've been, then you remember how far you've come. And that's the mystery of repetition. And he says it opens up more mysteries even as it brings clarity. This is probably more important to me than anybody else because my brain's always been broken. I can't properly patch together everyone I've loved and killed, every decade I endured, every army and team I've been a part of, every organization that's used me, every bottle of whiskey drank and claw popped and mouth smashed against mine in a savage kiss. It's the mind wipes, it's the memory plants, it's the expanse of time, it's the centuries plus of living and fighting that has taken a toll. I've never known what was real or not. I still don't know, despite traveling back the way I came because I changed the way of things. No point in dedicating too much time or worry to history. You can't change the story that's already started. The only thing you can control is the ending. And this is just an amazing monologue here. And here's the reason why. Because Wolverine, because of the fights that he and Omega Red have had, both over the course of his life and then in terms of Marvel publication history for the short amount of time that Omega Red was really relevant, that he talks about familiarity here. There is a familiarity in terms of his fighting with Omega Red, that it's something he knows, that it's not simply just a time stream thing, that the two of them have been fighting for any number of years. But in terms of one of the things, and probably the most interesting thing about this, is yes, there's the mind wipes, and yes, there's the false memory implants, which technically shouldn't be the case because of the post-Decimation era, or the post-House of M era, and Decimation, Wolverine getting his memories back, although Marvel had changed that following Daniel Way's Wolverine Origins, that the idea of Wolverine just having been alive for so long, that think about yourself, for example, right? I know that for example, you have moments in your life where you look back and you're like, I wonder if that really happened or if it was just a dream, right? Did I dream I did that, or did I really actually do that? And it all just kind of meshes together. And there are elements of your life where you're not even sure that truly happened. And that's you at maybe like 30 years old, or 40 years old, or 50 or 60 years old. Now imagine you're 200 years old. Did you really fall in love with that woman, or did you dream it? Did you really have that child, or is it just something you imagine that just feels real because your mind is trying to find some way to make sense of this thought that you're uncertain about, right? Whatever the case happens to be, after a while, the experience of your life, it all just kind of merges together into a series of scenarios that may or may not be real, leaving out all the mind wipes and the memory implants, right? That in and of itself makes things more difficult. Then you add in the false memories and you add in the mind wipes, and your life literally becomes a smorgasbord of memories which may or may not be true. And so following this, again, this fight between the two was absolutely amazing and I absolutely adored it. Following basically what looks like the death of Omega Red, whether or not it'll stay, whether it'll stick or not, I have no idea. I mean, Wolverine literally ripped him in half. It seems as though Omega Red may very well be resurrected back in Krakoa, but remember, they decide who gets resurrected and who doesn't. And that while Omega Red had previously been brought back, Omega Red actively worked to kill Xavier. The mutants on Krakoa really have no motivation to bring him back. So he may or may not return, right? It may be one of those things where they're essentially putting him on the back burner, and then at some future point in time, Benjamin Percy's left it open for a writer to bring him back, depending on the circumstance and whether or not it's needed. But a cool thing about this, kind of a small little takeaway about this, is that you do have this bit of a logbook, right? Remember that we get these logbooks over the course of the X-Men comics, which are designed to kind of fill things in. And that what we get from the log of Sage, who again is basically kind of like the living computer of Krakoa, the one that keeps an eye on like different transcripts and audio feeds and all kinds of stuff, that she's basically been keeping an eye on Mikhail Rasputin. And that from an anonymous source, which came from the Daily Bugle, Mikhail Rasputin failed to fulfill a promise to Russia, and now he finds himself in a situation of defensive retreat. The Kremlin is presently in a closed-door session with him. Shouting can be heard on both sides. What is the expression in English? On his knees. Mikhail Rasputin is on his knees. And so, in effect, whatever it was that led to Mikhail Rasputin basically grabbing Omega Red and then sending him into the time stream in order to kill Xavier, that this is basically him working for the Kremlin, working for what is either the Russian government or basically a secret faction in the Russian government that was looking to kill Charles Xavier and eliminate the entirety of Krakoa retroactively by going back in time. So they're messing with the time stream. Again, we don't necessarily know who this is, but I am interested in finding out. And so the last little tidbit that we get here, because this Cerebro sword is basically an artifact that can send the consciousness of a person into the past. So this sword has probably become one of the most important things in the entirety of Marvel Comics right now. The sword is handed over to Sage by Wolverine. And of course he's like, okay, like I'm gonna go sleep for a year. She's like, actually you can't. We need you. And he's like, what could you possibly need right now? She's like, well, the island's under attack. And when Wolverine asks, okay, well, it must not be that massive of a threat because quite literally, I don't see the whole island mobilizing. The response of Sage is, well, it's actually under attack by you, by Omega Wolverine. So with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.